Hey, I'm Courtney Waterman, your tutor. Lover of anime, manga, and math. And you just tuned into another session of Tutor Me Sempai. Welcome back, everyone. Today we're jumping into a 6th grade topic, independent and dependent variables. Now, if you're new to my channel, I'll be putting time codes in for this video in the description box below. So use that to skip ahead to whatever part of the video you think is most interesting. As always, if you have any questions about what you see today or even your own homework, you can always visit me on my Facebook page at Tutor Me Sempai and tell me all about it there. Today's video will have 5 parts, so leave a like, smash subscribe, and let's get started. Since we'll be talking about our independent and our dependent variables today, let's first focus on our independent variables. Now, both of the variables will show up in at least 3 different scenarios, one of which is your word problems. You can see them in your equations, and you can also see them in your science experiments. They will show up in all of those different scenarios, and they will roughly act the same way in each one. But looking at the independent variables, those are going to be the ones that do not depend on whatever else is happening inside that scenario. Hence the name independent variables. They're independent of everything else. These are going to be the variables that you control. Independent variables have a few different names. You can call them the manipulated variable because you're manipulating it. You can call it the control variable because you have control over it. You can even call it input. So if you're thinking about input versus output, your input is what you put in there. Your independent variable will be considered the input. So all of this points to the fact that you control what the independent variable is going to be. It is not going to change regardless of what's happening outside unless you tell it to change. You have full control over your independent variable. Contrary to our independent variables, our dependent variables are going to be the variables that we had the least amount of control over. They're going to be fully dependent on whatever's happening in the scenario around them. Hence the name dependent variable. They depend on something else, and they will change if any of those other factors are going to be changing. You have no control over them, and they have a few different names as well. Remember, we said our independent variables can be called input. Then that means our dependent variable will be the output. So if we had input, we're going to have some kind of output. Remember, you control the input, but you don't necessarily control the output. What you do to the output is you measure the output. So we can even call this the measured variable. We manipulate the independent variable and we measure the dependent variable. We measure what is going to be the outcome. So once again, our independent variable is going to be the one that doesn't change unless you tell it to do so. That means no matter what happens in its scenario, it's not going to change. It doesn't matter if your stuff changes inside your equation, if your stuff changes inside your word problem, or even stuff changes inside your science experiment. It's not going to be affected by any of those other changes. It only changes when you tell it to change. Dependent variables are going to be the exact opposite. You don't tell it to change. It's going to change as other things around it are changing. It's fully manipulated by everything going on in its surroundings. So if stuff is happening in your science experiment, it's going to be affected by that other stuff happening in your science experiment. If there are things in your word problem, it's going to have an effect. So you got to know what's affecting that dependent variable because that can change the outcome. And you'll be measuring this change as you take into account those other factors. So your dependent variable is the measured outcome of your scenario. So now that we talked about our independent and our dependent variables, let's look at a couple of examples in which we can try to pull out both of these types and tell which one is going to be which. Let's look at our first example, and we're going to read this word problem and try to extract the independent and the dependent variable. So our word problem says, Keisha is preparing for her performance. Each dance in her performance requires a different costume. And we want to determine which one of our two variables is going to be our independent and which one is going to be our dependent. Our two variables are going to be C, the number of costumes needed, and D, the number of dances performed. Once again, which one is going to be our dependent and which one is going to be our independent? Well, if we look at C, the number of costumes needed, and we look at what we said in our original question, it says that each dance requires a different costume. Well, it seems like this is going to be our dependent variable. We don't have any control over the costumes. They're fully dependent on how many dances we're doing. So this is going to be our dependent. You see, it depends on how many dances. That's how we'll know how many costumes we need. So that means that the number of dances are going to be what? The number of dances is going to be our independent variable. We control how many dances we're going to do in the performance. Well, Keisha controls how many dances she's going to do in the performance. And because she can control how many dances she does, that's going to be our independent variable. She has control. She's manipulated that. And because she's manipulated that, she can measure how many costumes are going to be needed afterwards. So this is going to be independent. Let's look at another example. So in our second example for today, we have Sasha planning her wedding. And the number of announcements she orders is going to be determined by the number of guests that she invites. We want to see which one of our two variables is going to be our independent and which one is going to be our dependent. We see we have G, the number of guests, and A, the number of announcements. So which one, when looking at our question, is going to be our independent variable? So let's look at this G, the number of guests. Looking back at our question, it says the number of announcements she orders is determined by the number of guests. So it seems like the number of guests controls how many announcements that she orders, right? It's determined by this. It quite literally says it's determined, so controlled by the number of guests. So that means the number of guests should be our independent variable. This is our control variable. We determine, or Sasha determines, how many guests she wants to invite. She has full control over that, so this is going to be our independent variable. That means the number of announcements that she orders, which fully depends on the number of guests that she invites, is going to be our dependent variable. It depends or is determined by the number of guests. So this is our dependent variable. Let's look at one more example. In our last example for today, we have Jasmine who likes to go biking every morning. And the further she bikes, the more calories she burns during the ride. And we want to determine which of these two variables is going to be our independent and which one is going to be our dependent. We see our first one is the number of calories burned. And we see our second one is going to be the distance biked. So which one of these two is going to be our independent versus our dependent variable? So looking back at this first one, the number of calories burned. We see the farther she bikes, the more calories she burns. The farther she bikes, the more calories she burns. If you were to break this up into cause and effect, the cause would be biking really far, and effect would be calories being burned. When you bike really far, you burn more calories. So biking far is going to cause more calories to be burned. So burning calories depends on how far you bike. Therefore, this should be our dependent variable. The number of calories burned is going to be fully dependent on how far she bikes. So this is dependent. That means the distance biked is going to be our independent variable because that is going to be determined by Jasmine. She can control how far she bikes. Therefore, she has manipulated the input, and the output is just going to be how many calories she burns. So this is going to be our independent variable. So I hope you're able to follow on today's examples, and I hope you now know your difference between your independent variables and your dependent variables. But of course, if you have any questions about what we saw today, or even your own homework, you can always visit my Facebook page at Tutor Me Sempai and tell me all about it there. If you haven't done so already, remember to leave a like. It really helps the channel by letting YouTube know that you found the video helpful. And if you found the video helpful, so can someone else. So leave a like, hit the notification bell, smash the subscribe button, and share this video with a friend. That's all the time I have for today. I really hope to help with your homework, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again next week. I'm Courtney, and this has been another session of Tutor Me Sempai.